Oh man, so we are back. I hope all you guys are doing well. I figured that today we would actually do a Regulation G tier list. Reason being is that starting on January 1st, the format is going to officially move back to Reg G. I don't know when it necessarily ends, but it is coming up very soon, and I wanted to post up this video to just help out anyone that's like team building for tournaments coming up or whatever. Obviously, we're going to only be touching upon the restricted Pokemon today. We're not going to be touching any of the unrestricted Pokemon like Urshifu or Incineroar or whatever. We just want to focus on the main pieces of what like everyone's teams are going to be, because obviously in formats like this, you build your entire team around the restricted that you choose, and then you just kind of go from there. How I'm going to do this list is that obviously like S tier is going to be the best on the entire list. A tier is going to be like Pokemon that are really close to S tier, but I think just missed a cut but are still really good. B and C tier are going to be like middling Pokemon, where B is kind of like the upper end of the middling Pokemon and C is like the lower end. D is going to be Pokemon that like they've had uses at some point in times. They have certain niches, but like they're not amazing. And then F is just like for Pokemon that aren't good at all and you should not bother using. The thing is, I've tested most of these Pokemon, so I have a solid idea of like what's good, what's not. And then the other thing is that I just want you guys to take into consideration is that when making this tier list, it's not necessarily only based on like the strength of the Pokemon and how strong they are. It's based on many factors. So obviously strength plays a role, but then like how well does it match up into the current meta, and then how flexible is it with the way that you could build teams around it, because there's certain Pokemon on this list where there's many different teams that you could build around them that are all equal in strength or all very strong, and then there's some Pokemon where there's only like one way you could build its team, and then it just kind of struggles if you try to do anything else. So there's multiple factors that kind of play into the list. To start it off, we're just going to put all like the F tier Pokemon down here. I'm not really going to get into like why you shouldn't use them. Just take my recommendation. These are like the Pokemon you should not bother with. What am I missing? I'm missing Necrozma. Yeah, like these are all Pokemon. They just have better forms. So like Calyrex here obviously has Caly-Ice and Caly-Shadow. You should just use those. The Zacian and Zamazenta have their better forms. Their crowned and shield forms or whatever they call it. Cosmog obviously has like Solgaleo and then Lunala. Kyurem has its white and black forms, which are better, and then Necrozma just has Duskmane and Duskwings, which are just far better than it. So yeah, you might as well just like not bother using any of these. None of them are really good. But if you want to go and have fun, you enjoy that. Getting onto D tier, what I think's like at the very, very bottom of D tier is probably Zekrom. Zekrom, it's really unfortunate. It really suffers from just kind of power creep over the years. It never was really like that great, even all the way back in like 2016 when that was like the first restricted format I played. But as the years have gone by, it's just really suffered. Like there's a bunch of like really good fairy types now in the game. Like obviously you have Fluttermane. Well, in this format in particular, there's not a lot of fairy types, but Fluttermane being added to the game doesn't help it. And then the fact that also you have Miraidon and then Raging Bolt in the format doesn't really help it as well, because the thing is with like Miraidon, obviously it's like way stronger than this, and then Raging Bolt, although I would say overall it's slightly weaker than Zekrom, the gap between them isn't that big where you could justify using Raging Bolt, and then you don't end up eating your restricted slot if you use Raging Bolt. So yeah, Zekrom really suffers from just Pokemon that are either stronger than it or that are really close to it that don't need a restricted slot. So yeah, it kind of falls in D tier, but who knows, maybe someone could find a niche, just because the one difference between it and Raging Bolt and it and Zekrom, Miraidon is that it is actually a physical attacker. So that's like its one like little niche, but yeah, I wouldn't really recommend using it, but who knows, maybe there's someone that will find a way. Kyurem Black, it's like slightly ahead of Zekrom, but still not very good. It actually has a higher attack stat than Calyrex-Ice, so it actually hits very hard, but the issue is that like its abilities like kind of and then the other thing is, again, it is competing with Caly-Ice, which is just like far bulkier than it. It has a better signature move, and then to add on top of that, it's also competing with Chen Pao, which is another great physical attacking ice type that also doesn't eat up a restricted slot. So this thing also kind of falls down to D tier, which is unfortunate because I think it's actually a really cool looking Pokemon, but as far as competitive use, not amazing. Lugia is right down here in D tier. it also, like, the biggest thing that it suffers from is just it has such a terrible typing. Flying Psychic, it doesn't sound awful, but when you take into consideration the fact that it's weak to Electric, Ghost, Dark, and then Ice, which are all like very commonly used types in the format right now, with like Caly-Shadow, Caly-Ice, Miraidon, and then you have Dark types like Incineroar, and then like Urshifu Dark, and Chien-Pao, and Chi-Yu. It just makes it really, really hard for this thing to kind of do well right now, even with the multi-scale ability. There is like a niche to it where you could run like leftovers and like get back to your multi-scale and full HP, but it right now is really, really struggling. And then the last Pokemon in D tier I would say is Mewtwo. Mewtwo, its niche is that it could just like use Expanding Force. It does get access to that move. You could put it next to Indeedee, but there is a much better Expanding Force user right now in Calyrex-Shadow, so you might as well just use Caly-Shadow if you plan on using an Expanding Force team. But it's down here in D tier because I don't know, maybe it should be in F tier, but I'll leave it down here for now. Going on to C tier, these are like the Pokemon that I think in the right circumstances could actually be good, but they're much more difficult to make work than like the stuff at the top. Right at the bottom of C tier, I would actually put Giratina Origin Form. The thing about Giratina Origin Form is that most people may not realize it. It's actually a lot bulkier than some people might take into consideration. So when you do play against it, sometimes people don't realize like how well it could take a hit, and then it takes a hit and then just like KO something in return. The biggest drawback to it is that it's a fact that it does have the Ghost typing attached to it right now, making it weak to Caly-Shadow, and then also weak to Dark types as well. Plus, it's also weak to Ice types in Calyrex-Ice form as well. So, yeah, not really a great typing for the format right now. Plus, it also is forced to run the Gracias Orb on it. So, like, you can't run another item outside of the Gracias Orb. You can't use, like, Leftovers or, like, Life Orb or whatever. You're forced to use that into your item slot, which is a bit unfortunate. Regular Giratina form's a little bit better just because it like pretty much does the same things as Origin. There's a little bit of a difference in like their stat spreads, but not like so drastic that I would call it like major. But the difference is that it could actually use like any item that you so choose, so that's why I have it a little bit ahead. Right ahead of Giratina, I have Reshiram. Reshiram, I know this one seems a little weird, but the thing is about Reshiram is that when you put it on a Sun team, it actually could do a lot of damage, and I don't think some people realize the amount that it could do, especially when it's in Sun. Obviously, it is competing with other like really strong fire types right now, like Chi-Yu, but it can do a lot of damage. I think back in 2022, which was the last restricted format before this one, it got like 11th, I think, at Japanese Nationals, which was really cool, but keep in mind that was the Dynamax era, so a lot of its weaknesses were kind of hidden with Dynamax, but it somehow did alright then, so I'll put it like here in C tier, because who knows, maybe there's like a niche that you could use. So Galio, I'll put here in C tier. Again, it having the Psychic typing really, really suffers against Caly-Shadow, but it did get, I think, first place at Japanese Nationals back in 2019, and it's kind of cool because it's like a pretty solid physical attack and steel type. It can't get its attack lowered because of its ability. I think it's like Full Metal Body or something. It's basically Clear Body, but just with a different name, which is kind of stupid. But yeah, it did get first place at Japanese Nationals in 2019. It's like an alright Pokemon. I mean, I wouldn't really consider it for a team right now just because I think there's another physical attack and steel type that's a lot better in Zacian and Zamazenta, but if you could use this, the one niche that it does have over Zacian and Zamazenta is that it does get Trick Room, but like, yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't really consider kind of using it over those two Pokemon, but it's whatever. I'll put Ho-Oh in here. Ho-Oh, it's kind of like, I don't know, it's in a really weird spot because I think it actually pairs really well with Gastrodon, and it can actually get some like very cheeky burns with Sacred Fire, but there is also Entei, which is available right now, which doesn't eat a restricted slot, but Ho-Oh, the fact it does get Regenerator, the fact that it is very bulky, I think gives it a justification for being in C tier, but it still isn't like that great. But yeah, I think it's like okay-ish. Like, I wouldn't use it personally. I would certainly not consider it, but if you want to, go for it. I would say definitely pair it with Gastrodon, and then like the other four, it could vary a lot. Right ahead of it, I have Kyurem White. Kyurem White actually, so this is where I think kind of like the cutoff is, where I think the C tier Pokemon start actually getting like kind of decent-ish. Like not amazing by any means, certainly not on the same level as like the S or A tier Pokemon or even the B tier Pokemon, but there are certain scenarios where Kyurem White could actually be really strong, specifically on snow teams when you pair it next to Alola Ninetales, because it does get access to Blizzard and it has 170 special attack, which is actually higher than Calyrex-Shadow. So if you give it like choice specs on one of those snow teams, now your blizzards are 100% accurate, plus you have a chance at freezing your opponent, which is like the dumbest status condition in the game, but it is possible that you could get some like cheeky wins with it. So I think this is like a pretty good spot. I would certainly say that it's better than the stuff behind it, but not better than the stuff that I'm going to put ahead of it. Right ahead of Kyurem, I have Palkia Origin Form. I could see people maybe flipping these two around with Kyurem and Palkia Origin. I think Palkia Origin, the difference between it and Kyurem is that it does get access to Trick Room, which obviously like it has 120 speed, so it itself is not going to benefit as much, but it does have a little bit of a better defensive typing in Water Dragon, and then it still also hits pretty hard, but yeah, like, I wouldn't say it's amazing, but, like, it's fine. Just like Giratina Origin Form, it does have its item slot eaten up by, I think, it's like Lustrous Globe. I think that's the name of the item. I'm kind of forgetting. But, yeah, like, it does have its item slot eaten up, but it does have very good stats, and then Water Dragon is, like, just a solid defensive typing, so you could consider it, but I would say that if you are going to consider Palkia Origin, maybe just consider regular Palkia form, which I would put ahead of it. Just because regular Palkia, although like its stats are for the most part similar, it's a little bit slower with base speed 100. It does benefit in Trick Room a lot more than Palkia Origin, just because again it's slower, and then plus its item slot is not eaten up by like Lustrous Globe. You could run like Life Orb onto it, or other items like Citrus Berry if you want to make it bulky, or you could run an Assault Vest set. But like I think if you were to run Palkia just regular form, maybe like Life Orb or Citrus Berry would probably be best. Right ahead of Palkia, I have Rayquaza. I've seen this certain strategy where people run like Terra Normal Extreme Speed Rayquaza next to Chen Pao, so people are trying to like mimic the Dragonite Chen Pao core that we saw for like a couple regulations. Obviously, like Rayquaza is stronger than Dragonite, but the thing is, its extreme speed isn't like so much drastically stronger that I think it justifies, you know, eating up a restricted slot over Dragonite when you could just run Dragonite itself. But it does actually do a lot of damage. If you are not prepared for it, you could flat out lose a game. So just be kind of leery of that. So yeah. Right ahead of Rayquaza, I have Dialga Origin. Dialga Origin, like the reason why I have it ahead of like Palkia, even though Palkia doesn't like have its item slot eaten up just like Dialga Origin form does. The difference is Dialga Origin actually has a much better typing than Palkia. Palkia is Water Dragon, again, which is a solid type, but this is Steel Dragon, which is like, in my opinion, the second best type combination in the game after Steel Fairy. It itself, it could do a lot of damage. It's really bulky. It could set up Trick Room, and actually functions a little bit better in Trick Room than Palkia, or Palkia Origin form does, because it hits base, I think, 90 speed. So it's pretty good, solid steel type. I would put Dialga right ahead of it, just because unlike Dialga Origin form, regular Dialga, it doesn't have its item slot eaten up by, like, I think it's Adamant Globe or whatever the heck it's called. I forget the name, but yeah, its item slot's a little bit more flexible. Still really bulky, can set up Trick Room. Pretty nice Pokemon. Right at the top of C tier, I have Eternatus. Eternatus, I think it's actually, like, very underrated, and I could see people maybe justify putting it like right at the end of B tier. Me personally, I would say it's right at the top of C tier. The thing is, if Miraidon wasn't added to the game, I actually feel that Eternatus would be like way higher on the list, but because of Miraidon being added to the game, it really has kind of suffered from that. If you're going to run a set on it, I know there's some people that run like, what's it called, like Cosmic Power, the move where it raises its defenses and with like leftovers. I think you're actually better off going with a more offensive set, because it naturally has such good defenses that like you don't need to run a move that essentially boosts its defenses. It has like 100 and I think 40 HP and like 95 defense, 95 special defense, so you might as well run like a Power Herb with Meteor Beam and then like Dynamax Cannon and then probably Sludge Bomb or like Flamethrower or something. So yeah, but I think it's actually like alright. But don't run into like that trap of running like the defensive set because it's too slow paced for the format, and like this format's really, really quickly paced. So yeah, I would not recommend that. Going on to B tier. So this is where we're starting to get into like the pretty decent stuff. Right at the bottom of it, I have Duskmane Necrozma. Some people might say that this should be in C tier. The reason I have it in B tier is because it did actually finish second at Worlds back in 2019. Obviously, with like Calyrex-Shadow being added to the game, that kind of hurts it a little bit. But its ability is Prism Armor, so it takes 3/4 damage from like super effective attacks, and it also is pretty bulky. Plus, it could set up Trick Room. The thing is, if you aren't prepared for this thing, it could actually do a lot of damage. I've seen some people run kind of these cool sets where it's like they bulldoze next to it, activate a weakness policy, lower its speed, and set up Trick Room with it, and then they just like sweep through teams. It's actually pretty decent. I don't think it's like as terrible as some people might think. So yeah, it's a solid Pokemon, but it is competing with other two very strong Steel types right now, in Zacian and Zamazenta, so that's why I have it kind of like at the bottom of B tier. Right ahead of it, I have Duskwing's Necrozma. Where is it? It's right here. Haha. I have Duskwing's Necrozma. The thing is, Duskwings, it kind of fits more so on like those hard Trick Room teams. It's actually like pretty decent on those teams, but it's so one-dimensional in how the teams are structured around it that it does suffer a lot. Plus also the fact it has the same exact type as like regular Lunala and then Calyrex-Shadow hurts it a lot. But it did get top 8 at Japanese Nationals, so like it's decent enough, but you just have to be careful just because like its ability isn't as good as like regular form Lunala's, where it can get like just KO'd on turn 1 from a 4-time super effective attack, so you just got to be careful, but it's solid on those Trick Room teams. Right ahead of it, I have Groudon. Groudon, it's always been kind of a staple in restricted formats. I mean, it won Worlds back in 2019. I think it also won Worlds in 2010. Obviously, like the 2019 World Championship, it had its primal form, but even without its primal form back in 2022, it still got, I think, second at Worlds. So it is actually pretty decent. It could be used, I don't want to say as like a counter to Miraidon right now, just because its special defense is like okay, but if you do run an Assault Vest set and then run Precipice Blades on it, you could do a lot of damage, so it can be like a very surprising pick, but the thing is, I think if run correctly, it could actually be very devastating to certain teams. So, yeah, I think it's actually overall like pretty solid. The fact it could change the weather is really nice. Really strong move in Precipice Blades. It suffers from missing a lot. But yeah, don't count it out. I think if you were to run Groudon, again, like an Assault Vest set might be good. I also think like bulk up Leftovers could also be pretty solid, but that might be a little bit too slow paced for this format just because of how strong everything is and how fast it moves. But yeah, I think like it being in B tier is pretty fair, but kind of like at the back end of B tier. Right ahead of it, I have Lunala. Lunala is another Pokemon that I think is like very underrated right now. It also got top 8 at Japanese Nationals, and then it also did like really well in ladder, I think, for 2 of the seasons in Reg G back like in the summer. It's a pretty solid Pokemon. It's a little bit more flexible in the way that you could run its team as compared to like Duskwings. But yeah, the thing that I like most about Lunala is that you could stretch it out a lot more. So you could run like a Trick Room variation of it, you could run a Calm Mind Leftovers variation, you could run Wide Guard on it, you could run just pure attacking moves where it's like Meteor Beam, Moongeist Beam, Moonblast. So yeah, it's overall really solid. I think it can just be like used in so many different ways, which makes it very, very kind of like not necessarily splashable on teams, but it makes it a little bit more splashable than like the stuff behind it. So yeah, the fact that it could just be used in so many different ways, I think, is a big advantage for it. But again, with it having the same typing as Calyrex, that it kind of suffers from that just because Calyrex is stronger. Going right ahead, I think Zacian's just right ahead of Lunala. Solid Pokemon. It has the best type combination in the game in Fairy Steel. I understand that this thing got nerfed into the ground after Sword and Shield just because it was, to this day, like, it in Sword and Shield in 2022 was the strongest Pokemon ever in the history of the game. Like, that's not even debatable. And because of that, it got nerfed to the ground. But even with that, it still is really solid. It pairs up really nicely next to Chen Pao, where it could do a lot of damage. Great type combination, relatively bulky, pretty fast. The only Pokemon that's like notable that's faster than it is Calyrex-Shadow, but I think it hits like 148 as a speed stat, Zacian, so you could actually run it and outspeed like Miraidon and then KO it with Play Rough if you really want to. And then a lot of Miraidon right now do carry Terra Fairy, which you could just use Behemoth Blade into it. So yeah, really strong Pokemon. I could see an argument for it being like at the bottom of A, but I think it's more justified it being in B tier just because of like the nerfs that it suffered from, and then the fact that like with having like Fairy Steel coverage, sometimes you do want to run the move Sacred Sword, but then some people drop one of the moves to like run Substitute, so like you can't get like the full coverage that you want with it sometimes. But yeah, it's a solid Pokemon. I think it's decent enough. Right ahead of it, I have Koraidon. You could flip around Zacian and Koraidon depending on how you're feeling. I just like Koraidon a bit more just because it does have access to setting up the sun, which I think is a big deal. Plus, it also does a lot of damage. The biggest thing that the biggest thing that Koraidon suffers from is it just has a very poor type combination, as opposed to like Zacian, which has an amazing type combination. Koraidon, it's dragon fighting, so it's like weak. It's weak to a lot of stuff right now. It's weak to Psychic, it's weak to Flying, it's weak to Fairy, weak to other dragons, weak to Ice. So yeah, it kind of suffers from like its myriad of weaknesses, but the thing is it pairs up so well with other Paradox Pokemon like Fluttermane, like Raging Bolt. It also does well next to like Chen Pao. The thing is, I think like there's actually another way that people could run it that others have overseen. I think you could actually run it next to like Weezing and then put Ability Shield on it, where like obviously you ignore Weezing's neutralizing gas, but then it activates its ability and then it could do a lot of damage. But yeah, like solid Pokemon, it's sometimes you have to, well actually not sometimes, a lot of the time you have to Terra type it just because of its poor typing, but it can do a lot of damage and then it could blow through teams if you're not ready for it. Right at the top of B tier, I have Kyogre. Kyogre has always been solid no matter what format it's in. The thing is, though, in recent years, it has suffered from some stuff being added to the game. So, like, obviously, Rillaboom being added did not help it. And then Miraidon and Raging Bolt also didn't help it. And then, shockingly, Urshifu Rapid Strike also didn't help it as well. Because if your opponent has Urshifu Rapid Strike themselves, then you power it up with your own Rain. However, with that being said, Kyogre, if left unchecked, it could do a lot of damage with Water Spout in the rain, especially if it has like a Choice Specs onto it. And then the thing about it, it hits 90 as a speed stat, which is like, it could be bad, it could be good, it kind of depends on the Pokemon, but for Kyogre, I would actually say that's pretty good because it can be used in Tailwind and in Trick Room. So you could actually structure two different teams around it as opposed to like some of the Pokemon in the back end. So yeah. I think it's like overall pretty solid, could do a lot of damage, decent Pokemon. Right at the bottom of A tier, and what I think is the 5th best Pokemon, I would actually say Terapagos. Before you get your pitchforks, there's a huge justification for why I think Terapagos is like the 5th best restricted Pokemon. Just because it's in 5th, it doesn't mean that I think it's like bad. It still is a very solid Pokemon, it's still very good. The issue that I have with it is that it is a bit of a Terra Sync, where in order to make it like really useful in certain matches, you have to Terra type it like 99% of the time. And in a format where Terra typing is the main mechanic, you want to have flexibility with it. So you want to be able to Terra type like any of your Pokemon. You don't want one just eating the Terra type all the time. And Terapagos does suffer from that a lot. The other thing about Terapagos is that it also does auto lose in some matchups, specifically against like Zamazenta teams, which are like, I wouldn't say super popular, but are like used commonly enough for it to like kind of be scared right now. Plus also Urshifu is on like every team that I've seen, because Urshifu's the best non-restricted right now in my opinion. So it does kind of just have certain like matchups that are really tough, and then the fact that it is a Terra Sync really sucks for it. But the good thing about it is that when it does Terra type and when you use Terra Star Storm, especially with like Choice Specs on it, or if you use a Calm Mindset and then get the +1, it does a lot of damage. Plus also the fact that it is kind of a hard counter to Calyrex-Shadow right now, I think is a big deal, because that Pokemon's really strong as well. But yeah, I think it's like deserving to be in 5th right now. Solid Pokemon, but the fact it is a Terra Sync and the fact it does have some matchups where it auto loses is like not great. But yeah. Right ahead of it, I actually have Calyrex-Shadow. This is another one that might be very controversial. I said at the beginning of the video how I'm making the list is that it's based on a multitude of things, not only just the Pokemon strength, but also the teams that you build around it and how it pairs up into the meta currently. Calyrex-Shadow is probably the absolute like strongest Pokemon in the game right now as far as just raw strength. Like, I don't think there's any Pokemon that comes... Well, there are some Pokemon that come close to it, but it is definitely like the king of the hill right now. It's just by far the strongest Pokemon, has the strongest signature move in Astral Barrage. It hits like a truck, it outspeeds everything. But why do I have it down in A tier? The main reason I have it down in A tier right now is because it just pairs like kind of awkwardly into the meta right now. Because it's so strong and because it's so oppressive, people are like running countermeasures to it like out the wazoo on their teams, and these overcorrections have just made it really hard for it to thrive right now. So I've been seeing teams with like multiple wide guard users, like wide guard Iron Valiant, wide guard Pelipper, wide guard Zamazenta. I've been seeing multiple dark types on a team like Incineroar, Urshifu Single Strike, Chien-Pao, Chi-Yu. I've been seeing multiple normal types to be immune to Astral Barrage, like Farigiraf. I've seen Ursaluna, Blood Moon, and regular Ursaluna. I've seen Smeargle on occasion. Obviously, there's Terapagos, which is another normal type. And then I've also been seeing like people run Terra Normal on certain Pokemon. So they'll run like Terra Normal on like Fluttermane or whatever. So because there's so many just countermeasures in place for it right now, it's made it really tough for it. With that being said, it still, in my opinion, is like the absolute strongest Pokemon in the game, but considering how poorly it kind of matches into certain things in the meta right now, I think having it in 4th is pretty justified. Moving on to S tier, I would actually say Zamazenta is the 3rd best restricted Pokemon. I think it's really strong, man. The fact it has Steel as like one of its main types, obviously it's Steel fighting, but having Steel is always great. In my opinion, Steel is probably like either the best type in the game or the second best type in the game. It kind of depends on preference, but it's just such a good defensive type that it just really helps it out, especially with its ability where it gets a +1 defense boost. I mean, it has a lot of resistances. It could do a lot of damage with Body Press. The other thing about it is that it does get access to Y-Guard, which is really helpful into Calyrex-Shadow right now, and Kyogre with Water Spout, plus Groudon with Precipice Blades. So... And then also it's like really helpful into Calyrex-Ice with Glacial Lance. So yeah, I think Zamazenta is really, really strong. If you're running a Terra type into it, some people go Dragon, which I think is pretty solid. Me personally, I like Terra Grass into it just to kind of avoid a Mungus Spore and then to be able to target the slot next to it. But there's a lot of games where Zamazenta, it forces other people to kind of like Terra type certain Pokemon. So like obviously if they lead Incineroar into Zamazenta, then the person either feels obligated to Terra type it immediately into Ghost type or just hard switch it out into a Ghost type, which makes it like pretty predictable into some matchups to like make a hard read into something. The other thing about Zamazenta is that also, unlike Terapagos, it's not a Terra Sync. Like, you don't need a Terra type it every game. In fact, the way I've been using it, like, because the current team I'm using right now actually has it on it, most games I actually haven't even bothered Terra typing it, just because like having Steel as a primary defensive like type on it, it just makes it like it's really useful, especially if this Pokemon's used in a defensive sense, which a lot of people use it for. So yeah, the second best restricted in my opinion, I would say, is Miraidon. I know Miraidon won Worlds, but the thing is, it does have a tough matchup into Calyrex-Ice right now, and plus the other thing is that it does also have a tough matchup into Chien-Pao. With that being said, it's super strong. It hits really, really hard, and like if you're not ready for it, it could just blow up entire teams. The issue that I have with it, though, is that it's kind of like linear in the way that it plays. Obviously, the main set is like choice specs, do a lot of damage, outspeed everything, but having that kind of like linear way in that it's played, it does take away from it a little bit and make it a little bit more easy to predict what it's going to do. With that being said, the fact it does so much damage and there's not a lot of stuff immune to Electro Drift right now, or like, yeah, just like stuff that's immune to Electro Drift right now, it makes it really, really tough to play against. It's really strong. Great Pokemon. The best restricted, in my opinion, is Calyrex-Ice. I don't think this one's like a shock to anyone. Calyrex-Ice, like some people might be saying like, wait a minute, doesn't it get like Glacial Lance blocked by Y-Guard like Calyrex-Shadow does? Yes, that's the case. However, the difference between Calyrex-Ice is that it could be played in multiple modes. So, like, the thing is, it's so bulky that it could function outside of Trick Room, where you don't even have to set it up some games, and you could just, like, click moves like High Horsepower with it or Glacial Lance. And then there's other games where you could just set up Trick Room with it and then, like, pair it up next to Amoonguss and just start sporing things and then click Glacial Lance. The other thing also about Glacial Lance is, unlike Astral Barrage, there isn't a Pokemon that has any typing that's immune to Glacial Lance. So Astral Barrage, obviously, like, if your Pokemon's normal type, it can't get affected by Ghost type moves, but Glacial Lance, it hits everything in the format. It does a lot of damage. It's really strong. It can set up Trick Room. Very oppressive. The other thing also, as compared to the other restricteds, it's by far been the most consistent. So, like, the 3 major events leading up to Worlds back in 2024 was Japanese Nationals, NAIC, and then obviously Worlds, and it got 2nd place at Japanese Nationals, 1st place at NAIC, and then 2nd place at Worlds. So it's just by far been the most consistent restricted. In my opinion, it's the strongest. I just think it's the best. With that being said, does that mean that, like, you're forced to run it on your team in order to find success? No. Like, I think if you run either Calyrex-Ice, Miraidon, Zamazenta, Calyrex-Shadow, or Terapagos, that's always, like, a great place to start. The stuff in B tier you could run, but it's going to be a little bit more difficult to kind of make them work. But I think if you start with any of the Pokemon in S or A tier, you're already ahead of the curve. So, yeah, that's my list. You guys tell me what you think in the comments. I actually want to hear what you guys think. But, yeah, I think this is pretty solid. So, I hope everyone has a nice day. Enjoy yourselves, and I will see you all next time.